Margaret's hand trembled as she reached toward the ornate mirror leaning against the storage unit's back wall. And when her fingertips brushed the cold glass, she saw not her own 73-year-old reflection, but the face of a 23-year-old woman with dark curls and eyes full of fire. The woman she'd been the night she told Robert she was leaving him. Wait, before the next revelation happens, if this mystery has already captivated you, tell us where you're watching from. And to make sure you don't miss any unexpected alliances or life-changing discoveries, subscribe and join our circle. The game is about to change. Now, back to the scene. Robert stood frozen behind her, his walker abandoned at the entrance of Unit 247. The morning sun cut through the dusty air of the Pine Valley storage complex, illuminating particles that danced like memories. He'd seen it too. Margaret knew by the way his breath caught, that distinctive hitch that had punctuated 50 years of marriage. "That's not possible," Margaret whispered, pulling her hand back as if the mirror had burned her. But the image remained, her younger self, wearing the blue dress with white polka dots, the one she'd worn to the county fair in 1975. The dress she'd buried in the back of a closet for 30 years before finally donating it to Goodwill. Robert moved closer, his steps careful despite his shock. He'd recovered from the stroke 6 months ago, but his left side still carried a weakness that made Margaret's heart clench every time she watched him struggle. They'd come to this auction on a whim, their first outing in months that wasn't to a doctor's office. The storage unit had cost them $275, the most frivolous purchase they'd made since Robert's medical bills started arriving. "Look at yourself," Margaret said, her voice barely audible. "Robert, look." He positioned himself beside her, and in the mirror surface, a young man with thick black hair and broad shoulders stared back. No walker, no tremor in his hands, no scar from the bypass surgery. Just Robert at 25, wearing his factory uniform, grease still smudged on his left temple from the evening shift. The storage unit around them was a chaos of forgotten lives. Cardboard boxes stacked floor to ceiling, some split open to reveal yellowed newspapers, old kitchen appliances, and clothing from decades past. A broken bicycle leaned against one wall. 3 garbage bags bulged with what appeared to be linens or curtains. And in the center of it all, commanding the space like an altar, stood the mirror. It was magnificent, nearly 7 feet tall, housed in a frame of dark wood carved with intricate patterns. Vines twisted around the edges, interspersed with flowers Margaret couldn't identify. At the top, 2 birds faced each other, their beaks nearly touching. The glass itself seemed to ripple slightly, as if it were liquid rather than solid, though when Margaret looked directly at it, the effect vanished. "This isn't real," Robert said, but his hand was already moving toward the mirror. When his fingers made contact, he gasped. Margaret watched her husband's reflection transform. But it wasn't just the physical changes, the straightened spine, the full head of hair, the muscled forearms. It was something in his eyes, a light she hadn't seen in years. Hope, maybe, or possibility. "I can feel it," Robert breathed. "Margaret, I can feel my strength. My legs, they're—" He stopped, looking down at his actual body. The walker stood 3 feet away, a reminder of current reality. But in the mirror, he stood tall and certain. Margaret felt tears building behind her eyes. She'd spent the last 6 months watching Robert struggle with buttons, with stairs, with the simple act of getting out of bed. She'd learned to hide her own exhaustion, her own fear that this was their new normal. Her taking care of him while he slowly diminished. And now, this mirror showed them what they'd lost. "We should take it," Robert said suddenly. "Well, clean out the rest, sell what we can, but this mirror?" "It's just a trick," Margaret interrupted, though she couldn't look away from her younger face. "Some kind of optical illusion. Curved glass, maybe, or—" "Does that look curved to you?" It didn't. The image was impossibly clear, impossibly accurate. Margaret could see the small scar on her younger self's chin from when she'd fallen off her bike at age 7. She could see the freckle pattern across her shoulders, visible above the dress's neckline. She could even see the silver chain her mother had given her, the one she'd lost at a beach in 1978. Who would store something like this? Margaret wondered aloud. She turned away from the mirror, examining the unit with new attention. The name on the auction manifest had been R. Castellano, unpaid since 2019. No other information. The unit had been sealed for 6 years. Robert moved to the nearest box, lifting the flap with surprising steadiness. Inside were photograph albums, their covers cracked with age. He opened the top one, and Margaret leaned in to see. Black and white photographs, mostly. A young couple on their wedding day. The woman in a long dress with a veil that cascaded past her waist. The man in a military uniform. More photos showed them at various ages, standing in front of a house, holding babies, surrounded by growing children. In one image, they stood before this very mirror, and Margaret felt a chill run through her. "They look happy," Robert observed. He flipped through more pages. The couple aged in the photographs, their family expanding and then contracting as children moved away. But they were always together, always touching, a hand on a shoulder, fingers intertwined, heads bent close. The final photograph in the album showed the couple elderly, perhaps in their 80s. They sat on a porch swing, and the woman's head rested on the man's shoulder. Both were smiling, but there was something in their eyes, a sadness, a knowing. Margaret closed the album carefully. She moved to another box, finding it full of letters bound with faded ribbons. The handwriting on the envelopes was elegant, each one addressed to Rosa from Richard. She pulled one out, dated July 1953. "My dearest Rosa," it began. "The days without you feel twice as long. I count the hours until my leave, when I can hold you again." "Love letters," Margaret said softly. She didn't read further, feeling like an intruder. But she noticed the stack contained hundreds of letters, covering what must have been years. Robert had moved to a different section of the unit. He called out, "Margaret, there's furniture under these tarps." She joined him, and together they pulled back a paint-stained canvas. Beneath it sat an exquisite vanity table, complete with a matching stool. The wood was cherry, polished to a deep shine despite decades of storage. On the vanity's surface sat a silver brush set, a jewelry box, and a small framed photograph. The same couple from the albums, young and radiant. "This belonged to someone who loved beautiful things," Margaret murmured. She opened the jewelry box and found it full of costume jewelry, nothing expensive, but everything well-maintained. There were also 2 wedding rings on a small velvet cushion. Robert picked up one of the rings, examining it in the light from the doorway. Inscription inside, R&R, forever circling. Margaret felt something twist in her chest. She looked back at the mirror, where their young selves still waited, frozen in a moment 50 years past. "Why would someone abandon all this?" she asked. Robert set the ring down carefully. Maybe they didn't have a choice. Maybe there was no one left to want it. The implication hung in the air between them. They had no children, no nieces or nephews close enough to care about their possessions. When they died, who would sort through their house? Who would find the love letters Margaret had kept from their early courtship? Who would understand the significance of the chipped teacup from their honeymoon or the blanket from their first apartment? Margaret walked back to the mirror. Her young face stared out at her, and for a moment she wanted to reach through the glass and shake that girl. Tell her to hold on tighter, to fight harder for what mattered, to not let the years slip past in routine and resentment. Because that girl didn't know yet. She didn't know that she would come back, that the leaving would last only 3 weeks before she showed up at Robert's factory at shift change, crying, admitting she'd been wrong. That young Margaret thought she wanted excitement, adventure, a life bigger than their small town could offer. She didn't yet understand that the biggest life was the one you built slowly, day by day, with someone who knew your worst parts and loved you anyway. "What were we fighting about?" Robert asked, startling her. He'd moved to stand beside her again, their older selves reflected in the conventional way in the unit's metal door, their younger selves captured in the mysterious mirror. "What? That night, when you left, what was I so angry about?" Margaret frowned, trying to remember. It had seemed so important at the time, worth ending everything over. You wanted to stay in Pine Valley. I wanted to move to the city. That was it? You'd just gotten the promotion at the factory. You didn't want to leave. And you had that job offer, the boutique in Portland. They were both quiet, remembering. Margaret had thought the boutique would be her chance to become someone important, someone who mattered. Instead, she'd spent 3 weeks in a tiny apartment, attending a job she hated before admitting the truth. She'd left Robert not because of the job, but because she was terrified of how much she loved him, terrified of the vulnerability that came with letting someone see you completely. "I was such a fool," Margaret said. "You came back. But I left in the first place. I hurt you." Robert reached out and took her hand. His grip was weaker than it once was, but the gesture was familiar. "And I forgave you. We've been over this, Margaret. How many times? 50 years, and you still punish yourself for 3 weeks. It was cruel. It was human." He squeezed her fingers gently. "And I wasn't blameless. I'd been cold for months before that, focused on my career, on proving something to my father. I'd stopped seeing you, really seeing you. No wonder you felt alone." Margaret looked at their joined hands, then at the mirror. Their younger selves stood close but not touching, both looking straight ahead. There was distance between them in the reflection, space that represented the gulf they'd crossed that terrible autumn. "Do you think it's magic?" she asked. "The mirror?" "I don't know what I think, but I know what I see." "What do we do with it?" Robert considered. "We could sell it, probably worth something to a collector. Or we take it home, put it somewhere we can see it every day." Margaret felt a flutter of anxiety. Why would we want that? A reminder of what we've lost? Is that what you see? Loss? Robert turned to face her fully, abandoning his reflection. "I see proof that we survived. We were those people, young and stupid and full of fire, and we became these people. Older, yes, weaker in some ways, but we're still here, Margaret, still together. That mirror doesn't show us what we lost. It shows us what we built." His words settled over her like a blanket. She looked back at the young woman in the mirror, at the defiance in her eyes, the stubbornness in the set of her jaw. That woman had thought leaving was strength. It had taken her years to learn that staying was stronger. "Well, need help moving it," Margaret said finally. "It's too heavy for us." Robert smiled, the expression transforming his face. "I'll call Jimmy next door. He owes me for fixing his lawnmower." They spent the next hour exploring the storage unit more thoroughly, discovering layers of a life lived fully. There were children's drawings carefully preserved in plastic sleeves, a box of military medals and commendations for Richard Castellano, who'd apparently served in Korea and Vietnam. Another box held programs from school plays, ballet recitals, and graduation ceremonies. They had 4 children, Margaret said, piecing together the evidence. 2 boys, 2 girls. And lots of grandchildren, by the look of it. Robert showed her a box of newer photographs, printed on glossy paper. Holiday gatherings with dozens of people, spanning multiple generations. So why did this end up in storage, Margaret wondered, with no one to claim it? She found part of an answer in a manila folder tucked into a leather suitcase. Legal documents, including a death certificate for Rosa Maria Castellano, deceased March 2018. Cause of death, heart failure. She'd been 91 years old. Another death certificate, dated January 2019. Richard Anthony Castellano, 93. Cause of death, complications from pneumonia. But there were other documents too. Letters from lawyers, from a company called Golden Years Estate Management. Correspondence about selling the family home, liquidating assets, distributing funds to beneficiaries. One letter, dated June 2019, mentioned that items of sentimental but not monetary value had been placed in storage, with fees to be paid from the estate. But something had clearly gone wrong with the payments. The children didn't want any of this, Robert said, reading over her shoulder. They took the money and left the memories in storage. Margaret felt a surge of anger on behalf of Rosa and Richard Castellano. They'd built this life, raised these children, loved each other across decades, and their legacy had been reduced to an unpaid storage unit auctioned off to strangers. "That won't happen to us," she said fiercely. "When we die, we don't have children to disappoint us," Robert pointed out, not unkindly. "No, but we have each other, and when one of us goes, the other will make sure." She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. They both knew the statistics. After 50 years of marriage, when one partner died, the other often followed within months. They joked about it darkly in the past, neither wanting to be the one left behind. Robert pulled her into an embrace, as much as his limited mobility allowed. Margaret leaned into him, breathing in the familiar scent of his soap, the laundry detergent she'd been using for 30 years. "I'm not ready," she whispered. "I'm not ready to lose you." "Who says you will? I'm too stubborn to die. The doctor said I need to take it easy and do my exercises. I'm doing that. I'm going to be around to annoy you for a long time yet, Margaret." She wanted to believe him, but she'd seen the medical reports, understood the severity of what his body had been through. The stroke had been a warning, the doctor said. Another could come at any time, and the next one might be fatal. A sound from outside the unit made them both turn. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway, middle-aged and well-dressed, with silver streaking his dark hair. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent. "But I saw the unit was open, and I had to check. I'm looking for something that belonged to my parents." Margaret and Robert exchanged glances. Robert spoke first. "Are you one of the Castellanos?" The man's expression shifted from hope to surprise. "Yes. How did you—" He saw the boxes, the opened albums, the evidence of their exploration. "You bought the unit." "At auction this morning," Margaret confirmed. "I'm Margaret Chen, and this is my husband Robert. We didn't know the history when we bid. We just—" She gestured helplessly at the chaos around them. "I'm Marco Castellano," the man said, stepping inside. His eyes immediately found the mirror, and his face went pale. "Oh, God, you found it." "You know about the mirror?" Robert asked. Marco moved toward it slowly, as if approaching something dangerous. When he looked into the glass, his expression crumpled. "It's real. I thought maybe I'd imagined it after all these years, but it's real." In the mirror, Marco's reflection showed him as a young boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old. He wore shorts and a striped shirt, and his face was split in a wide, gap-toothed grin. "I haven't seen myself like this in 40 years, Marco breathed. "I'd forgotten what I looked like before everything got complicated." Margaret watched him, understanding dawning. "Your parents, the couple in the photographs. This was their storage unit. It shouldn't have been." Marco tore his gaze from the mirror to face them. "When they died, we were supposed to distribute everything, my sisters and brother and I, but we couldn't agree on anything. Who got which photographs, which pieces of furniture? Everyone claimed to be the favorite, to deserve more. It got ugly. Lawyers got involved." He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture weary. "Finally, we just said the hell with it. We sold the house, split the money, and put everything sentimental in storage. The estate lawyers were supposed to maintain the fees indefinitely. But somewhere along the way, someone dropped the ball. Or maybe," He paused. Maybe one of my siblings stopped the payments deliberately, thinking they could come back and claim it all later. That's terrible, Margaret said softly. It's what we became, Marco agreed. 4 children who loved each other once, who grew up in a home full of love, and we turned into strangers fighting over money and possessions. He looked at the mirror again. My parents would have been heartbroken. Robert had been listening quietly. Now he asked, "What did you come here hoping to find?" Marco smiled sadly. "The mirror, actually. My mother told me about it once, near the end. She was in the hospital, and I was sitting with her overnight. She couldn't sleep, so she told me stories about how she and my father found the mirror at an estate sale in 1952, right after they got married. About how it showed them their younger selves, and how they'd look at it whenever times got hard. She said it reminded them of who they'd been, so they wouldn't forget who they wanted to be." He touched the frame gently. "She made me promise to keep it safe after she was gone, to make sure it stayed in the family. But when she died, and then Dad 2 months later, everything fell apart so fast. The lawyers were pushing us to make decisions, and my brother was angry about the will, and my sister was going through a divorce, and I was trying to hold everything together while also grieving." Marco's voice cracked. "I forgot about the mirror. I forgot my promise." Margaret felt tears on her cheeks. She thought about the love letters, the photographs, the carefully preserved memories of a life well lived. And she thought about how easily it could all disappear, be scattered to strangers, lose its meaning. "When did you remember?" she asked. 6 months ago. I was in therapy. The family falling apart had destroyed me, and the therapist asked me to talk about my parents. I remembered the hospital, my mother's stories, her request, and I realized I'd failed her." Marco looked at them imploringly. "I've been trying to track down the storage unit ever since." "But the estate company had gone out of business, and the files were a mess. And by the time I found the right facility, the unit had already been auctioned this morning. I drove here as fast as I could." Robert glanced at Margaret, and she saw the question in his eyes. They owned the unit legally. They could keep everything, including the mirror. It was their right. But Margaret thought about Rosa and Richard Castellano, who'd loved each other across decades, who'd raised 4 children and built a life worth remembering. She thought about Marco, broken by his own family's collapse, trying to honor a deathbed promise. And she thought about herself and Robert, childless, with no one to carry on their story when they were gone. "Take it," Margaret said suddenly. "The mirror. Take it home." Marco stared at her. "I can't ask you to do that. You bought the unit. It's legally yours. I'll pay you for it, whatever you want." "We don't want your money," Robert interrupted. He moved to stand beside Margaret, unified in their decision. "Your mother asked you to keep it safe, so keep it safe." "But," Marco looked overwhelmed. "Why would you do this?" Margaret smiled, feeling lighter than she had in months. "Because some things are more important than ownership. Because your parents' love story deserves better than to end up in strangers' hands. And because," she paused, finding the words, "because maybe by helping you keep your promise, we're keeping a promise of our own." Marco's eyes filled with tears. He pulled out his phone with trembling hands. "Let me at least pay you what you spent at the auction, and for your time. Please, I need to do something." "Keep your money," Robert said firmly, "but help us sort through the rest of the unit. Tell us the stories behind these things. Help us understand what mattered to your parents." So they worked together through the afternoon, Marco sharing memories as they organized boxes. The photograph of Rosa and Richard at their wedding had been taken at City Hall because Richard was shipping out to Korea the next day. The letters Robert had found were written during Richard's deployments, 1 letter for every day they were apart. "Mom kept every single one," Marco said, his voice thick with emotion. "And Dad did the same with hers. Even after email came along, they still wrote letters by hand on their anniversary. The children's drawings had been carefully saved, each one labeled with a name and date. Marco laughed and cried as he went through them, pointing out his terrible spelling, his sister's obsession with horses, his brother's stick-figure monsters. "We were so loved," he said quietly. "How did we forget that?" The medals belonged to Richard, who'd rarely talked about his service. He had nightmares sometimes, Marco shared. Mom would hold him and sing old Italian songs her mother taught her. She said music was the only thing that could bring him back from the dark places. As the sun began to set, they'd sorted the unit into 3 groups: things for Marco to take, things to donate, and a small pile that Margaret and Robert wanted to keep. A set of beautiful pressed glass bowls, a vintage radio that might still work, and a painting of a lifehouse that reminded Margaret of their honeymoon. The mirror stood apart, waiting. "I should arrange for movers," Marco said. "It's too valuable to risk and too heavy." "We'll help you get it to your car," Robert interrupted. "Between the 3 of us, we can manage." "Robert, your health," Margaret started. "I'm fine. We'll be careful." Marco looked uncertain, but Robert was already positioning himself at one side of the mirror. "Come on, we do this together." It took them 20 minutes and several rest breaks, but they managed to maneuver the mirror out of the storage unit and across the parking lot to Marco's SUV. They had to fold down the seats and angle it carefully, but it fit. As Marco secured it with blankets and bungee cords, Margaret said, "There's one thing I've been wondering. Does the mirror show the same age for everyone? Is it always the same moment in time?" Marco finished his work and turned to face them. "My mother said it shows you as you were during your most essential moment, the time when you became truly yourself." "So for you, that's 8 years old?" Robert asked. "9, actually. That was the summer my father taught me to fish. We spent a week at Lake Como, just the 2 of us. He told me stories about his childhood in Italy, about coming to America, about meeting my mother. It was the first time I understood that my parents were real people with their own stories, not just mom and dad." Marco smiled at the memory. "I think I learned more about being a man that week than in all the years that followed." Margaret looked at Robert, understanding flooding through her. Her essential moment, wearing that blue dress at the county fair, hadn't been about the dress at all. It was the night before she left him, the last moment she'd felt truly alive with possibility, before fear made her run. And Robert, in his factory uniform, grease on his temple, that was the night she'd come back, the night he'd been working late, trying to distract himself from missing her, and she'd showed up at shift change with her suitcase and her heart in her hands. That was the moment he'd chosen forgiveness over pride. "Your mother was a wise woman," Margaret said. "She was." Marco closed the SUV's rear door carefully. "Thank you, both of you. You've given me more than just the mirror. You've given me hope that I can fix things with my siblings, that it's not too late to become the family we're supposed to be." They exchanged contact information, Marco promising to send updates on his reconciliation efforts. As he drove away, the mirror safely secured in his vehicle, Margaret felt Robert take her hand. "We should get dinner," he said. "I'm starving. We should get you home." "You've overdone it today." "I feel fine. Better than fine, actually." He squeezed her hand. "I feel alive." Margaret looked at her husband, truly looked at him, perhaps for the first time in months. He was standing straighter, moving with more confidence. The haunted look that had shadowed his eyes since the stroke was gone, replaced by something brighter. "The mirror," she whispered. "When you touched it." "I felt something," Robert admitted, "like a current running through me. And when I saw myself as I was, I remembered what it felt like. The strength, the certainty. And I thought, why can't I feel that way now? Just because I'm older doesn't mean I'm done living." Margaret felt tears welling again, but these were different. These were tears of hope. "You scared me so badly. When you had the stroke, I thought I was losing you." "You won't lose me that easily. I've got too much I want to do still." He pulled her close, both of them standing in the storage facility parking lot as evening descended. "I want to travel. Remember how we always said we'd go to Italy? Let's actually do it. Let's stop waiting for someday and start living like we're those people in the mirror, full of possibility." "Robert, be realistic. Your medical condition is manageable. The doctor said I can live a normal life if I take care of myself." Normal doesn't have to mean sitting around waiting to die, Margaret. It can mean living fully for whatever time we have left. She wanted to argue, to list all the reasons why they should be cautious, why they should protect themselves from disappointment. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw the young man from the mirror looking back at her. "Okay," she said. "Okay, Italy. We'll start planning tomorrow." Robert grinned, and it transformed his face. "See? That's my girl. The one who doesn't back down from a challenge." They drove home in comfortable silence, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Margaret found herself thinking about Rosa and Richard Castellano, about a love that had survived wars and child-rearing and the daily wear of decades, about a magic mirror that showed them who they'd been so they wouldn't forget who they wanted to be. At home, Robert insisted on making dinner, pasta with the red sauce his mother had taught him to make 60 years ago. Margaret protested, worried he'd tire himself, but he waved her concerns away. "I've been letting you take care of everything since the stroke," he said, pulling out pots and ingredients. "But I'm not an invalid, and I don't want to be treated like one. Let me cook for my wife." So Margaret sat at their kitchen table, drinking wine and watching her husband move around their kitchen with purpose. He was slower than he used to be, yes, he had to take breaks, had to use his right hand more than his left, but he was doing it, and the look of satisfaction on his face was worth more than any amount of careful caution. Over dinner, they made plans, not just for Italy, but for everything they'd been putting off. Robert wanted to take ballroom dancing lessons, something they'd talked about for years. Margaret wanted to finally learn to paint. They'd visit the storage facility again to collect the items they'd set aside, and maybe they'd keep exploring estate sales and auctions together. "We should look for our own mirror," Margaret joked, "so we can look at ourselves and remember to be brave." "We don't need a magic mirror for that," Robert said. "We have each other." That night, lying in bed with Robert's breathing steady beside her, Margaret thought about essential moments, about the mirror showing people who they truly were, at the time they most became themselves. She'd spent 50 years thinking her essential moment was about leaving, about having the courage to walk away from something that wasn't working. But maybe the mirror had been showing her something different. Maybe her essential moment wasn't about leaving at all. Maybe it was about what came next, about having the courage to admit she was wrong, about choosing love over pride, commitment over freedom, the known over the unknown. That woman in the blue dress at the county fair, she was the last version of Margaret who thought she had to choose between herself and Robert. The next version, the one who came after, learned that loving someone completely didn't mean losing yourself. It meant finding yourself reflected in another person's eyes. The next morning, Margaret woke to find Robert already up, dressed, and doing his physical therapy exercises in the living room. She watched from the doorway, marveling at his determination. "How long have you been up?" she asked. "An hour. I wanted to get a head start." He finished his leg lifts and turned to her, breathing only slightly hard. "I called Jimmy. He's coming over later to help me in the garage. I want to fix up that old radio we got from the storage unit." "Robert, you don't have to." "I want to. I spent 6 months being afraid of my own body, Margaret. Afraid that if I pushed too hard, I'd have another stroke. But hiding from life isn't living. I'd rather have 1 good year doing things I love than 10 years sitting in this chair being careful." Margaret understood. She crossed the room and kissed him, deep and long, the kind of kiss they'd shared when they were young, and every moment felt urgent and important. "Then let's make it a good year," she said. They spent the day in purposeful activity. Robert and Jimmy worked on the radio, their laughter drifting from the garage. Margaret started researching art classes and found one at the community center that started the following week. She also looked into travel options for Italy, printing out information on accessible tours that would accommodate Robert's needs without being restrictive. That afternoon, Marco called. His voice was bright with excitement. "I took the mirror to my sister's house last night," he said.
Just showed up unannounced. She looked into it and saw herself at 15, the age she was when she won the state championship for gymnastics. She started crying, said she'd forgotten what it felt like to be that proud of herself. "That's wonderful," Margaret said. "We talked for hours, really talked, for the first time in years. She told me things I never knew, about how she'd felt overshadowed by our brother, about struggles I'd been too self-absorbed to notice. And I told her about my own regrets, my own failures." Marco paused. The mirror didn't just show us who we were. It showed us who we could still be. "We're going to talk to our brother and other sister this weekend, try to rebuild what we broke." After they hung up, Margaret told Robert about the conversation. "That mirror is magic," Robert said. "Not in the fairy tale sense maybe, but in the way it makes people remember, makes them hope." "Do you think we would have bought the unit if the mirror hadn't been there?" Margaret wondered. "If it had just been boxes and furniture, would we have even bid?" "I don't know. Maybe the mirror called to us somehow. Maybe it knew we needed it as much as we needed to help Marco." Margaret smiled at the whimsy of the idea, but part of her believed it. The mirror had shown themselves at their most essential moment, not young and unburdened, but young and choosing, young and becoming. The weeks that followed were full of new beginnings. Margaret started her art class and discovered a talent for watercolors. Her teacher praised her use of light, the way she captured emotional atmosphere. Robert's physical therapy improved dramatically as his motivation returned. The therapist commented on his progress, amazed at his dedication. They collected the items they'd saved from the storage unit, setting up the vintage radio on their mantle once Robert got it working. It played jazz from a local station, and on Friday nights they'd push back the furniture and dance in their living room, Robert's walker abandoned in the corner as he held Margaret close and swayed to the music. The pressed glass bowls became the centerpiece of their dinner table, always filled with fresh fruit or flowers. And the lighthouse painting hung in their bedroom, a reminder of their honeymoon, of the young people they'd been who had no idea what the future held. Marco sent updates regularly. He and his siblings had reunited over Sunday dinners, each week rotating houses. They'd begun sorting through their parents' legacy properly, dividing items based on meaning rather than monetary value. The mirror moved from house to house, and each sibling reported profound experiences with it. "My brother saw himself at 21, the year he became a father," Marco wrote. "He said it reminded him that he'd once been young and scared and trying his best. It helped him forgive himself for not being perfect." In December, Margaret and Robert celebrated their 50th anniversary. They'd planned a quiet dinner at home, but Marco surprised them by showing up with the mirror. "I thought you might want to see it again," he said, "on your anniversary. A gift from one couple who made it work to another." They set the mirror up in their living room, and Margaret and Robert stood before it together. Their younger selves stared back, Margaret in her blue dress, Robert in his factory uniform. But something was different now. In the mirror, they stood closer together, and their hands were reaching for each other. "That wasn't there before," Margaret breathed. "Maybe the mirror changes," Marco suggested. "Maybe it shows you what you need to see when you need to see it." Robert put his arm around Margaret's shoulders, and in the mirror, their younger selves embraced. And Margaret understood. The first time they'd seen the mirror, they'd needed to remember who they'd been individually, the moment of choice, of becoming. Now, on their anniversary, the mirror showed them their essential moment as a couple, the moment they'd chosen each other, truly and completely. "Thank you," Margaret told Marco, her voice thick with emotion, "for trusting us with this, for letting us be part of your family's story." "You're part of it now," Marco said simply. "You gave me back my family. You gave me the courage to try. That makes you family too." He stayed for dinner, and they shared stories late into the night. Stories of love and loss, of mistakes and forgiveness, of the long, hard work of staying together when everything tells you to walk away. When Marco finally left, taking the mirror with him, Margaret and Robert stood at their door watching his taillights disappear down the street. "Do you wish we could keep it?" Robert asked. "The mirror?" Margaret considered. Part of her did want it, wanted the daily reminder of who they'd been, who they could be. But a larger part understood that they didn't need it anymore. "We carry the mirror with us now," she said. "Every time we make a choice to live fully, every time we choose each other, we're creating our essential moments every day." Robert kissed her temple. "When did you get so wise?" "I learned from a magical mirror in a storage unit." "And here I thought you learned from 50 years with a stubborn old man." "That too." They went inside, locking the door against the December cold. The house was warm and full of light, full of the life they'd built together. Not a perfect life. They'd had their struggles, their failures, their moments of doubt. But it was theirs, earned through decades of choosing and being chosen, forgiving and being forgiven. In bed that night, Margaret said, "I'm glad you didn't give up after the stroke. I was so afraid you'd given up." "I almost did," Robert admitted. "It's easier to surrender than to fight." "But then we found that storage unit and that mirror, and I remembered something I'd forgotten." "What's that?" "That I married a woman brave enough to leave me and brave enough to come back. How could I be less brave than her? How could I give up when she never did?" Margaret felt tears on her cheeks. "I love you. I don't say it enough, but I love you. I know. You show me every day." "How?" "The way you check my pills. The way you pretend not to notice when I'm struggling. The way you researched accessible tours so we could still go to Italy. The way you've carried us both when I couldn't carry my share." Robert pulled her close. "That's love, Margaret. Not the flowers and poetry kind, though I should do more of that. But the daily kind, the kind that lasts." They fell asleep wrapped together, 50 years of history between them, and however many years ahead they had left. They would make them count. They would live each day aware of how precious and fleeting time was. Spring came, and with it their trip to Italy. They flew to Rome, then took trains to Florence, Venice, and finally to Lake Como. Robert moved slowly but confidently, refusing a wheelchair and insisting on walking as much as he could. Margaret let him set the pace, discovering that slower travel meant noticing more. The way light hit ancient stone, the taste of gelato eaten slowly in a piazza, the sound of church bells echoing across water. At Lake Como, they stood on a dock at sunset. The mountains reflected in still water, and Robert said, "This is perfect. This exact moment. I want to remember this forever." "We will," Margaret promised. And she meant it. This moment would become another essential one, another point in their story, where they became more fully themselves. Two people who'd chosen each other half a century ago, who'd fought and forgiven, who'd survived illness and hardship, standing together in a beautiful place, grateful for every single day. When they returned home, they framed photos from the trip and added them to the collection of memories that filled their house. Margaret's watercolors improved, and she started painting scenes from their travels. Robert joined a woodworking class and began crafting small boxes and picture frames, each one a gift for friends who'd supported them through the hard times. They heard from Marco regularly. His family continued to heal, gathering every Sunday, sharing the mirror among households. One of his sisters had started therapy and was working through old resentments. His brother had reconciled with his ex-wife and was building a better relationship with his adult children. "The mirror saved us," Marco wrote, "but you too showed us it was possible. You showed us that love can survive anything if you're willing to fight for it." Margaret and Robert didn't see themselves as heroes or examples. They were just two people who'd stumbled through life together, making mistakes and trying to do better. But maybe that was enough. Maybe showing up every day, choosing love over and over again, was the most heroic thing anyone could do. On a warm June evening, Margaret and Robert hosted a dinner party. Marco and his siblings came, along with neighbors and friends from their various classes and activities. The house was full of laughter and music, the pressed glass bowls overflowing with strawberries from the farmer's market, the vintage radio playing jazz. At one point, Margaret found herself in the kitchen with Marco's sister, Anna, who was helping to prepare dessert. "Marco told me about the mirror," Anna said. "About how it showed you at the moment you were leaving your husband," Anna confirmed. "That must have been hard to see, the reminder of that pain." It was. But it was also a gift. Margaret arranged cookies on a plate, because it reminded me that our hardest moments can become our most important ones. The moment I left Robert, I was so sure I was doing the right thing, the brave thing. But coming back, admitting I was wrong, asking for forgiveness, that was braver. That was when I really became myself. Anna was quiet for a moment. "When I look in the mirror, I see myself at 15, right after I won the state championship. I was fearless then. I believed I could do anything. You still can." "No, that's just it. I'm 53 years old. My body doesn't work the way it did. I've failed at my marriage, struggled with my kids, made 1,000 mistakes. I'm not that girl anymore." Margaret set down the plate and took Anna's hand. "That girl is still inside you. Not as someone you lost, but as someone you've built on. Every experience, even the failures, made you who you are. The mirror doesn't show you who you lost. It shows you the foundation you built on." Anna's eyes filled with tears. "Marco said you'd understand. That's why he wanted to bring us here tonight, to meet the couple who showed him it was possible to stay together, to keep choosing each other." "We're not special," Margaret protested. "You are, though. In a world where everyone gives up, where families fall apart, where people walk away when things get hard, you stayed. You both stayed. That's revolutionary." Later, as the party wound down and guests began leaving, Marco pulled Marco and Robert aside. "I have something for you," he said. He went to his car and returned carrying a large, flat package wrapped in brown paper. "You didn't have to get us anything," Margaret said. "Just open it." They unwrapped the package carefully, and Margaret gasped. It was a painting, a professional portrait of the two of them, based on their reflections in the mirror. Young Margaret in her blue dress stood beside young Robert in his factory uniform, their hands reaching for each other, their faces full of hope and possibility. "I hired an artist," Marco explained. "I described what you looked like in the mirror, and she created this. So you'd have your own version, your own way to remember." Margaret couldn't speak. She stared at the painting, at these young people who'd had no idea what lay ahead of them. 50 years of marriage, a stroke and recovery, a storage unit full of someone else's memories that would become intertwined with their own. Adventures still to come. Robert's voice was gruff with emotion. Thank you. We'll treasure it." "You gave me back my family," Marco said. "This is the least I can do." After everyone left, Margaret and Robert hung the painting in their bedroom, opposite the lighthouse. Now they had two reminders of their journey together, the beginning and the middle, with the end still unwritten. "We should write our own story," Margaret said suddenly, "for after we're gone. So whoever ends up with our things will understand what they meant." "That's morbid," Robert said, but he was smiling. "It's practical.
We don't have children to pass things down to tell our stories. But we could leave something behind. Letters, maybe, or a journal. Something that explains who we were, what we built. Robert considered. All right, but we're not writing it as an ending. We're writing it as a middle chapter, because we're not done yet. We have more life to live, more memories to make. So they started a journal together, taking turns writing entries. They recorded the story of the storage unit and the mirror, of Marco and his family, of their trip to Italy and their new hobbies and adventures. They wrote about their mistakes and forgiveness, about the stroke and recovery, about 50 years of choosing each other. But they also left blank pages, lots of them, for the future memories they planned to create. The summer passed in a blur of activity. Margaret's watercolors were featured in a local art show. Robert built a beautiful jewelry box for Margaret's anniversary gift, inlaid with different woods in a pattern that reminded her of the carved frame on the magical mirror. In the fall, they took a trip to the coast, staying in a small bed and breakfast and spending long days walking on the beach, collecting shells, watching storms roll in across the water. Robert's strength continued to improve, though he tired more easily than he once had. But he never complained, never suggested they slow down. "I've lived enough of my life slowly," he said when Margaret worried he was overdoing it. "I want to live the rest fast." One evening, walking back to their room after dinner, Robert stopped suddenly, his hand going to his chest. "Robert!" Margaret's heart jumped into her throat. "I'm fine. Just give me a minute." But he wasn't fine. She could see the pallor in his face, the tightness around his eyes. She helped him sit on a bench, her phone already in her hand to call for help. "Don't," Robert said. "I'm fine. It's just indigestion." "You don't know that." "Margaret," he took her hand, "I'm not going to spend our vacation in a hospital. If it gets worse, I promise I'll tell you. But right now, I just need to sit for a minute." They sat together as the sun set, and gradually Robert's color returned. The tightness eased from his expression. But Margaret's fear didn't subside. She'd almost lost him once. She wasn't ready to face that again. That night, lying in the unfamiliar bed with Robert sleeping beside her, Margaret made a decision. Tomorrow she'd call their doctor, insist on tests, new scans, whatever was needed to make sure Robert was all right, even if he protested, even if he accused her of worrying too much. She couldn't lose him, not yet. Not when they'd finally learned how to really live. But morning brought no crisis. Robert woke feeling fine, energetic even. He wanted to go kayaking, something they hadn't done in decades. Margaret tried to dissuade him, to suggest something less strenuous, but he was determined. "If I die," he said, "I want to die doing something I love, not hiding in a hotel room being afraid." So they went kayaking. And Robert was strong and capable, his strokes steady as they paddled along the coastline. They saw seals sunning on rocks, eagles circling overhead, the vast Pacific stretching to the horizon. And Margaret realized Robert was right. This was living, being afraid and doing it anyway, embracing every moment, squeezing all the juice from the time they had left. When they returned home, Margaret did insist on a doctor's appointment. The tests came back showing Robert's heart was holding steady, no worse than before. The episode at the coast had been indigestion, nothing more. "You're doing remarkably well," the doctor said. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. The exercise, the positive attitude, it's working." Margaret cried in the car afterward, relief flooding through her. "I told you I'm too stubborn to die," Robert said, squeezing her hand. "You're stuck with me, Margaret Chen." "Good," she managed, "because I'm not done with you yet." Winter came again, their 51st year together. They hosted Christmas dinner for Marco's family, the house filled with noise and laughter and life. The journal they'd started together was filling with memories, with stories, with proof that they'd lived fully. On New Year's Eve, they stood in their living room, just the two of them, watching the countdown on television. At midnight, Robert pulled Margaret close and kissed her, the same way he'd kissed her 50 years ago when they were young and everything was ahead of them. "Here's to another 50 years," he said. "Let's start with another 5 and go from there," Margaret replied, but she was smiling. Deal. 5 more years of adventures, of living fast, of being brave. "Of choosing each other," Margaret added. "Always," Robert promised. "Always choosing each other." They stood together in the house they'd filled with memories, surrounded by the artifacts of the life they'd built. The vintage radio played quietly, jazz drifting through the rooms. The pressed glass bowls sat on the table, ready for tomorrow's celebration. The lighthouse painting and the portrait of their younger selves hung on the bedroom wall, reminders of journeys taken and journeys still to come. And though the magic mirror was in Marco's home, carefully passed between siblings, Margaret and Robert didn't need it anymore. They carried its lesson in their hearts, that the past shapes us but doesn't define us, that our essential moments can be found anywhere, in joy and in pain, in leaving and in coming back, in the daily choice to love someone even when it's hard. They were older now, slower, marked by time and experience, but they were still themselves, still becoming, still choosing, still living the story that had started with a young woman in a blue dress and a young man with factory grease on his face, 2 people who'd found each other and built something that lasted. Not because it was easy, not because they were perfect, but because when it mattered most, they'd chosen to stay, to forgive, to try again, to be brave enough to love completely. And that, Margaret thought, as Robert held her close and they swayed together to the music, that was the real magic. Not a mirror that showed you the past, but a commitment that built the future, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one moment at a time. The clock struck 12:01, beginning a new year, and Margaret and Robert danced in their living room, 2 souls who'd found each other across decades, who'd survived everything life threw at them, who'd learned that the truest magic was simply showing up, day after day, year after year, and choosing love. Always choosing love. Outside, fireworks lit up the winter sky, but inside, in the warm glow of their home, 2 people held each other and knew they already had everything they needed. They had their memories and their hopes. They had their mistakes and their forgiveness. They had their adventures and their quiet moments. They had each other. And that was more than enough. It was everything. The next morning, Margaret woke early and went to their journal. She picked up the pen and began to write. To whoever finds this someday, this is the story of Margaret and Robert Chen. We were ordinary people who bought a storage unit and found a magic mirror. But the real magic wasn't in the mirror. It was in the choice to see ourselves clearly, to remember who we'd been, and to become who we wanted to be. We built a life together. It wasn't always easy. We made mistakes, hurt each other, almost gave up. But we didn't. We chose to stay. We chose to forgive. We chose to be brave. If you're reading this, we're gone now. But we hope our story reminds you that love is a choice you make every day. That the essential moments aren't always the big ones. Sometimes they're just Tuesday afternoons, or quiet dinners, or holding someone's hand when they're afraid. Thank you for caring enough about us to read this. Thank you for giving our story meaning, even after we're gone. We hope you have love in your life, whoever you are. And if you don't, we hope you find the courage to choose it when it comes. With love from the past to your present, Margaret and Robert Chen. She closed the journal and placed it on the shelf, next to the photograph albums and the letters she and Robert had written to each other over the years. Someday, someone would find these things, maybe at an estate sale or an auction or in a storage unit of their own. And maybe, like Marco, they'd understand. They'd see not just objects, but a life lived fully. A love that endured. A story worth telling. Robert appeared in the doorway, coffee mugs in hand. "What are you doing?" "Writing the ending," Margaret said. "Or, at least, one of them. We'll write others as we go." "Good." He handed her a mug and sat beside her. "Because we're not done yet. I want at least a dozen more chapters before we're finished." Margaret leaned against him, breathing in coffee and morning light and the scent of the man she'd loved for 51 years. A dozen chapters sounds perfect. And so they began another day, another page, another choice to love and be loved. The magic mirror was gone, but they carried its reflection in their hearts. The young people they'd been, the older people they'd become, and the essential truth that connected them. Love wasn't something that happened to you. It was something you did every day, in 1,000 small ways. It was the choice to stay when leaving would be easier, to forgive when holding a grudge felt justified, to be vulnerable when protecting yourself seemed safer. It was the choice to see someone fully, their flaws and their beauty, their weakness and their strength, and to love them anyway. Margaret and Robert Chen had made that choice 51 years ago, and they made it again every single day. That was their magic. That was their legacy. And as the morning light filled their home, touching the objects that told their story, they knew that whatever time they had left would be lived the same way, fully, bravely, together. Always together. Always choosing love.